She had spent 12 years treating her husband like dead weight, a dull, unremarkable man who drove a used car, wore sensible shoes, and worked quiet hours from a sparse home office that smelled of old paper and strong coffee. So when Vivian Hargrove finally filed for divorce and marched out of their home with everything she could carry, she was completely certain she had won. She had taken the house, the savings accounts, the furniture, the art on the walls, the good appliances, and the last shred of her husband's dignity. What she hadn't taken, what she hadn't even known existed, was the $43 billion sitting in a network of holding companies, trusts and shell corporations, all of which bore one name and one name alone, her soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel Hargrove. That oversight would cost her everything. But before we get into exactly how that unraveled, and it unraveled spectacularly, go ahead and hit that like button right now if you're already hooked. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because stories like this one land in your feed every single week. Now, before we dive in, we want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. Are you joining us from London, Lagos, New York, Toronto, or somewhere else entirely? We read every single one. The morning Vivian Hargrove decided her marriage was over, she was standing in the kitchen of their modest suburban home in Millbrook, pouring herself a cup of coffee she hadn't made. Daniel had made it, as he always did, quietly and without a word, rising at 5:30 in the morning before she had even stirred. She looked at the cup. She looked at the man in the rumpled button-down shirt sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, and she felt nothing but contempt. "You're going to be late again," she said. It wasn't concern. It was an insult dressed up as an observation. Daniel looked up and gave her a small, tired smile. "I have a call at 7. I'll be fine." Vivian set her cup down on the counter hard enough to make a sound. "A call," she repeated, her voice dripping. "Another mysterious call with mysterious clients who apparently pay you mysterious amounts of money that never seem to amount to anything." She swept a hand around the kitchen. The clean but aging cabinets, the slightly scuffed tile floor, the refrigerator that was 3 years past its prime. "Look at this place, Daniel. This is where we live. This is what 12 years of your brilliant career has bought us." Daniel said nothing. He had long since stopped defending himself to her. Not because he had no defense, but because the defense would require an explanation he wasn't ready to give. Vivian had grown up wealthy. Not quietly wealthy, not practically wealthy. Aggressively, performatively wealthy. Her mother, Eleanor Voss, had made a career out of being rich, attending every charity gala in the city, sitting on every board that would have her, and treating the display of money as both a religion and a weapon. Vivian had inherited every one of those instincts down to the bone. When she had married Daniel 11 years ago, a man she had met at a corporate conference, a man who had been charming and sharp and quietly confident in a way that had intrigued her, she had assumed he was simply on his way up. She had told herself the modesty was temporary, that the used car and the small apartment were placeholders for something grander. She had been so certain that the man she was looking at was a rough version of a better, more impressive future version. She had been wrong on every count. In the years that followed, Daniel worked from home, consulting, he said, for a range of private clients. He never spoke about his work in much detail. He traveled occasionally, always economy class, always without fanfare, and he returned home the same quiet, unhurried man who had left. He drove the same 10-year-old sedan, he wore clothes from ordinary stores, he cooked dinner most nights, kept the house immaculate, and smiled the same patient, infuriating smile every single time Vivian expressed her dissatisfaction. And Vivian expressed her dissatisfaction constantly. She did it at dinner parties, when she would steer the conversation away from what her husband did for a living with the practiced deflection of a woman managing an embarrassment. She did it at family gatherings where she would smile tightly whenever Eleanor asked, with pointed sweetness, whether Daniel's consulting work had really started to take off yet. She did it at home, in quiet, devastating ways. The sigh when he declined to take her to a restaurant she wanted, the long look she gave his car every time he pulled it out of the driveway, the way she would announce at the beginning of conversations that she was not asking for much. The breaking point, as it often does in stories like this, came wrapped in the clothes of something else entirely. It came in the form of a man named Bradley Ashton. Bradley was everything Vivian believed Daniel was not. He was loud and charming and drove a car that turned heads and wore suits that announced themselves when he walked into a room. He was also, as Vivian would later have ample opportunity to discover, spectacularly bad with money, 3 times divorced, and entirely lacking in anything resembling a dumb conscience. But in the spring of that final year of her marriage, he looked to her like an answer to a question she had been asking for a long time. She did not hide the affair well. She didn't try to. There were late nights and unexplained absences, and a new perfume she wore that she had never worn before. There was a habit of laughing at her phone in the evenings, while Daniel sat across the room, his eyes on a book, saying nothing at all. He said nothing because he already knew. He had known for 2 months. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. A courier brought them to the house, and Daniel signed the receipt at the door with a hand that didn't shake. He carried them to the kitchen table, sat down, and read every word with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything. Vivian had retained one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the state, a man named Gregory Fitch, who had built a career and a formidable reputation out of maximum extraction. The filing was ruthless in its scope. It claimed 50% of all known marital assets, the house, the joint savings accounts, the investment portfolio Vivian's team had identified, the retirement funds. It cited Daniel's chronic lack of financial ambition as grounds for an unequal distribution in Vivian's favor. It included a request for spousal support based on the standard of living she claimed she deserved to maintain. It was a comprehensive, professionally executed act of financial warfare. What it did not claim, because it did not know, because it had never thought to look, was a single cent of the $43 billion. Daniel read the papers a second time, then he folded them neatly, placed them on the counter, and went back to his laptop. 2 weekends after the papers arrived, Vivian appeared at the house with her mother and 2 hired movers. She had not warned Daniel. She simply walked in through the front door, she still had a key, and began directing the movers through the rooms with the efficiency of a general commanding a campaign. Daniel was sitting in his armchair in the living room, reading, when they arrived. He looked up. He said nothing. "Don't make this difficult," Vivian said, not looking at him, her eyes moving over the furniture with a proprietary assessment. "My lawyer has established what's mine." Eleanor stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching Daniel, with an expression that could have curdled milk. She was dressed, as she always was, with immaculate care. As if being well-dressed was a form of moral superiority. "You should count yourself lucky," she said. Her voice was the kind of cold that had been cultivated over decades of practice. "A man with your track record should be grateful she isn't asking for more." Daniel looked at Eleanor for a long, steady moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not humiliation, not the wounded defensiveness that Eleanor had been expecting and, frankly, hoping for. Tea was something quieter, something that looked almost like a decision being reached. "Of course," he said, and he went back to his book. They took the dining room furniture and the good artwork and the expensive appliances Vivian had always insisted on. They took the bedroom set and 4 years' worth of carefully cultivated houseplants and the flat-screen television Daniel had bought on sale 3 years prior. They took the record player he had owned since college, a battered turntable with a cracked lid that he had repaired twice himself and which held no monetary value whatsoever. They took the rug from the entryway and the curtains from the living room windows, leaving the bare glass exposed to the grey October sky. When the movers finally drove away, the house was hollow and cold and smelled like the absence of something that had been there a long time. Daniel sat in his armchair in the stripped room and looked at the bare walls and the pale rectangles where the pictures had hung. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. "It's time," he said to the man on the other end. "I think it's time to stop waiting." The story of how Daniel Hargrove became worth $43 billion is not a dramatic one, and that is precisely the point. He had grown up the son of a mechanic in a small town in Ohio, a boy who was quiet and observant and possessed of a gift for finding patterns in things other people walked past without seeing. He had earned a full scholarship to study mathematics and economics at a state university, graduated at the top of his class, and gone to work for a small investment firm at the age of 22. By 25, he had developed a proprietary analysis model that predicted market movements with a consistency that made his senior colleagues deeply uncomfortable. At 27, he had quietly left the firm and started his own operation. Not a flashy hedge fund with its name on a glass tower in a financial district. A series of numbered holding companies, each nested inside the others like Russian dolls, managing capital for a small group of institutional clients who paid him generously and told absolutely no one. It was unglamorous work in many respects, meticulous, systematic, conducted in the same sparse home office that Vivienne had always viewed as evidence of failure, but it was also extraordinarily effective. By 30, Daniel's consolidated portfolio had crossed the $100 million mark. By 35, it was approaching $2 billion. By the time Vivian was directing movers through the house she believed was hers, the number was $43.2 billion. He had never wanted the trappings of wealth. That was the part that people always struggled to understand if they ever learned the truth, which very few people did. He had grown up watching his father work himself to the bone for wages that never quite covered the month, and had watched that man die at 62 with nothing to show for it but a house in need of repair and 3 kids who missed him terribly. Somewhere in that grief, Daniel had made a quiet, foundational decision. The money would never be the point. The point was the work, the problem-solving, the elegance of a system functioning exactly as designed. He had also, in the early years of his success, developed what his lawyer would eventually refer to as a fortress of privacy. His name appeared nowhere public. His companies had directors and officers listed on paper who were not him. His personal lifestyle gave no indication whatsoever of the empire running invisibly beneath it. He drove a used car and lived in a modest house and filed taxes through structures so sophisticated that even the accountants who processed them didn't always see the full picture. He had met Vivienne when he was 31 at a corporate conference in the city, and he had fallen for her quickly and perhaps unwisely. She was sharp and beautiful and possessed of a vitality that had seemed, at the time, like genuine passion for life. He had understood, on some level, that her interest in him was coloured by the assumption that his modesty was temporary, that the quiet man in the ordinary suit was clearly on his way somewhere impressive, and this was simply the beginning. He had told himself it didn't matter. He had told himself that once she knew him, really knew him, none of the money or the surface appearances would matter at all. He had been profoundly, comprehensively wrong. She had never tried to know him. She had only ever tried to appraise him, and the appraisal had never satisfied her. The years had passed in a slow accumulation of small humiliations, each one unremarkable in isolation, and together forming something that weighed a considerable amount. There was Vivian's habit of steering conversations away from his career at social events, as if it were a topic too embarrassing to address directly. There were the pointed remarks about other men's promotions and properties and achievements, delivered at dinner with a tone of gentle observation that was anything but gentle. There were the Christmas dinners at Eleanor's house, where the family's obvious wealth surrounded them, and Vivian's embarrassment was as palpable as the silverware. There was, in the 3rd year of the marriage, the comment Daniel had overheard through a half-open door at one of those very dinners, Vivian telling her mother, in a voice not quite low enough, that she had settled and wasn't sure what she had been thinking. He had carried that particular sentence for 9 years. The affair had ended whatever thread of hope he had still been holding. And the day the movers had stripped his house bare, something in him had quietly, finally clicked into place, like the last piece of a mechanism falling correctly into its housing. His lawyer's name was James Whitfield, a man in his early 60s who ran a small, discreet practice that specialized in exactly the kind of work that required absolute confidentiality. James had been managing the legal architecture of Daniel's empire for over a decade, and he had also been the one, quietly and without instruction, but with good professional judgment, to compile a complete financial disclosure report 3 months earlier, at the first signs that the marriage was approaching its end. It was a document that Vivian's legal team had never requested, had never known to request, and which contained information that would have made Gregory Fitch's carefully projected confidence collapse like a folding chair. "She's filed," Daniel told him that evening, sitting in the stripped living room with one lamp and his armchair. "And she's cleaned out the house." James was quiet for a moment on the other end. "Are you ready to proceed?" Daniel looked at the bare walls. "Yes," he said. "Let's make sure this is done properly." The following morning, Daniel drove to James Whitfield's offices in the financial district, not the gleaming towers where the largest firms resided, but a discreet suite on the 14th floor of an older building, the kind that communicated seriousness without advertisement. James met him at the door himself and led him to a long mahogany conference table that felt both formal and familiar. James opened a folder containing 47 pages of what he called the Full Disclosure Index. He walked Daniel through it with the measured calm of a man who had seen extraordinary things and had long since decided not to be surprised by them. The portfolio was staggering by any rational measure. The central holding structure was a company called Meridian Capital Partners, incorporated in Delaware and managed through a series of subsidiary entities spread across 4 separate jurisdictions. Meridian held controlling interests in 11 operating companies across technology infrastructure, private logistics, and energy development. The most recent independent valuation, conducted 6 months prior, placed the total consolidated value at $43.2 billion. Vivian's divorce filing had claimed assets totaling approximately $1.4 million. A house, 2 savings accounts, a modest joint investment portfolio, a retirement fund. She had missed $43 billion by the width of a question she had never thought to ask. "Has her legal team made any discovery requests beyond the standard?" Daniel asked. James shook his head slowly. "They requested bank statements for the joint accounts, tax returns for the last 3 years. which, as you know, reflect only your consulting income through the personal vehicle. And the property deed. He paused. They did not request corporate records. They did not request a full marital asset declaration. They assumed there was nothing beyond what they could already see. Because they assumed I was nobody, Daniel said. James allowed himself a small, precise smile. That is one way to put it. The plan James laid out was elegant in the way that truly devastating things often are. Because Vivian had filed first and done so aggressively, the legal landscape had shifted in ways her team had not anticipated and was not equipped to navigate. Daniel was legally obligated to make full financial disclosure in the divorce proceedings, and he would, every single cent, all $43 billion. But the disclosure would come layered with consequences that Vivian had not built into any version of her plan. The first was the immediate and dramatic revision of the asset division calculation. Because the marital estate was now revealed to be incomprehensibly larger than Vivian's filing had supposed, the entire basis of her asset claim collapsed. The second was a counterclaim filed on Daniel's behalf, citing financial misconduct during the marriage. Specifically, the documented use of joint marital funds to finance the relationship with Bradley Ashton, catalogued across credit card statements, hotel receipts, and a series of specific transfers from a joint account that James's team had assembled with surgical precision over the previous months. The third consequence was the one James delivered last, almost as a footnote, the way a careful person sometimes saves the largest item for the end of the list. Vivian's attorneys had, in their aggressive property claim, inadvertently triggered a review clause written into the deed of the Millbrook house, a clause stipulating that any legal challenge to the property's ownership structure required a full examination of the deed's original terms. Those original terms had always, without exception, listed Daniel Hargrove as the sole owner. Vivian's name had never appeared on the deed. She had been a co-resident, not a co-owner. The house she had stripped bare and walked away from with her chin up had never legally been hers to claim. Daniel sat with that information for a quiet moment. "She'll also need to return the property removed from the premises," James said, in the gentle tone of a man delivering news he knows will be satisfying. "All of it?" Daniel asked. "Every item," James confirmed. "The furniture, the appliances, the artwork, the television." He glanced at a line in his notes. "There's a specific mention here of a turntable." "I want the record player back," Daniel said. And for the first time in a very long time, in a way that had nothing to do with patience or endurance and everything to do with something clean and complete. He smiled. The disclosure was filed on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the document package had arrived at Gregory Fitch's office. By all accounts from those present, the man read the first page, turned to the second, and then sat in complete, absolute silence for approximately 4 minutes before he reached for his phone. Vivian was at lunch with her mother and Bradley at a restaurant Eleanor had chosen, the kind of place with white tablecloths and wine lists the size of novels. She let the first call go to voicemail. She let the second call go to voicemail. By the third call, she answered with a sigh that suggested the world was imposing on her at an inconvenient moment. "We have a problem," Gregory said. "What kind of problem?" Vivian asked, reaching for her glass. "The kind," Gregory said carefully, "where your husband's financial disclosure just arrived, and I need you to come to my office. Now." There was something in his voice she had never heard there before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the sound of a very confident man who was no longer confident. She arrived at his office 40 minutes later. Gregory was standing behind his desk, which was buried under printed pages, and he had the look of a man who had placed a very large, very public bet and had just watched it dissolve in real time. "What is this?" Vivienne said, picking up one of the pages from the desk. "That," Gregory said, "is a consolidated asset disclosure for an entity called Meridian Capital Partners." He sat down heavily in his chair. "Your husband is the sole beneficial owner of a holding company currently valued at $43 billion. The room went very still and very quiet. Vivienne set the page down on the desk. "That's not possible," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "It is possible," Gregory said. "It is fully documented, independently verified across multiple accounting firms, and legally unassailable." He spread his hands on the desk in the gesture of a man with nothing left to offer. "Vivienne, the asset claim we filed is now a serious liability. Because we filed specifically and aggressively, we opened the door to a counterclaim, and they have filed one." He walked her through everything: the counterclaim, the financial misconduct documentation, the credit card statements with the hotel names and the dates, the transfers from the joint account, time-stamped and categorized, the deed review clause and its implications, the court order that would follow. By the time he was finished, Vivienne was standing very still, both hands flat on the edge of the desk, in the way a person stands when the floor has disappeared beneath their feet, and they haven't yet decided how to respond to gravity. "The house," she said at last. "You're telling me the house was never mine?" "The property has always been solely in his name," Gregory confirmed. "Your filing triggered the clause. His attorneys have already submitted the request for the return of all items removed from the premises." He hesitated. "All items, Vivienne? The furniture, the appliances, the artwork?" She drove to her mother's house. She had been staying in Eleanor's guest suite since leaving Millbrook. She had moved in with the breezy confidence of someone who had just executed a winning move. She walked into the sitting room, sat down on the edge of Eleanor's immaculate white sofa, and stared at the opposite wall. "What's happened?" Eleanor said, appearing in the doorway with her reading glasses still perched on her nose. Vivienne told her. All of it. Flatly, without expression, the way a person delivers news they haven't yet fully processed. Eleanor sat down very slowly. She removed her reading glasses and placed them on the side table with the exaggerated care of a woman maintaining composure by its final thread. The room was so quiet that the clock on the mantelpiece sounded unreasonably loud. $43 billion, Eleanor said. 43.2, Vivienne said. Her voice was strange and flat, like something that had been pressed until all the texture was gone. Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice that came out smaller than she intended, "You let that man cook dinner every night for 12 years, and he was worth $43 billion? Neither of them said anything after that for quite some time. The clock on the mantelpiece kept going. The counterclaim, when it moved through the courts, moved with the unhurried certainty of something that has already won and knows it. The financial misconduct documentation was airtight, not a single disputed line, not a single missing receipt. Bradley Ashton, confronted via his own attorney with the scope of what had been documented, attempted initially to claim ignorance and then simply stopped returning Vivienne's calls entirely. He sent a text message on a Wednesday evening. She read it once, set her phone face down on the counter, and didn't pick it up again until the following morning. The court order for the return of the items came through on a grey Thursday. 2 weeks after Vivienne had walked out of the Millbrook house with movers and the posture of someone who had just won something, she watched those same items being carried back through the front door. She stood on the driveway in the cold November air and watched her dining room furniture, as she had thought of it for years, disappear back through a door that had never legally been hers. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt small. The financial misconduct settlement was handled out of court, with Vivian agreeing to repay the joint marital funds used to finance the affair. With legal costs and the applicable penalties calculated in, the figure left her personal accounts in a condition considerably more modest than they had been when this had all begun. The spousal support request was denied without ceremony. The asset division, recalculated against the full and accurate picture of the marital estate, was handled with such precision that what Vivian ultimately received was technically fair, genuinely, legally fair, and felt, after the month she had lived through, like a sentence being handed down. Eleanor, in the weeks that followed, began making calls. She moved through her social circle with the focused energy of a woman trying to locate the source of a leak, asking quiet questions, trying to understand how anyone who had known Daniel could have known him without knowing what he was. Every call went roughly the same way. Astonishment, some barely concealed admiration. Not a single person, it emerged, had known. Not one. He had moved through the world for 12 years as a quiet, unremarkable man, and the world had accepted the presentation at face value. That, Eleanor began to understand with a creeping, unwelcome clarity, had been entirely deliberate. It had been a choice, and she had never once thought to question it. Bradley Ashton vanished from Vivian's life with a speed that was its own kind of judgment. He had not signed up to be attached to a woman navigating legal bills and reduced accounts and the particular social aftermath of having tried to divorce a $43 billion man and come away with less than she'd started with. He relocated, someone told Vivian eventually. He was cultivating a new circle somewhere else. He had not left a forwarding address. The formal confrontation, the one that mattered, the one that had weight, came 6 weeks into the proceedings, in a conference room at James Whitfield's offices. It was called a mediation session. Both parties and both legal teams were present. The room was neutral and clean and smelled of fresh coffee and old wood paneling. Daniel arrived first. He wore the same kind of quiet, well-made clothes he always wore. A dark jacket, a plain shirt, nothing that announced itself. He sat on one side of the long table and waited with the stillness of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had made peace with it. Vivian arrived 7 minutes late. She was with Gregory Fitch, who had the bearing of a man operating in professional damage control mode, and she looked thinner than she had a month ago. The particular kind of tired that careful makeup cannot fully address had settled around her eyes. She sat down across from Daniel and did not look at him immediately. The legal formalities took 12 minutes. And then Vivian, departing from protocol in a way that made Gregory Fitch go very still beside her, spoke directly to Daniel. "Why?" she said. "Just that one word," asked, in a voice stripped of everything it usually carried. Daniel looked at her steadily across the table. He did not shift in his seat. He did not look away. "You want to know why I didn't tell you," he said. It was not a question. "You let me spend 12 years believing we were ordinary," Vivian said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath the control something jagged moved. "You let me believe—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again more carefully. "You humiliated me." Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had not rehearsed because he didn't need to. "In the 3rd year of our marriage," he said, "you told your mother at her Christmas dinner that you had settled. You said it while I was in the hallway, and I heard every word." He paused, and let the pause breathe. "In the 5th year, you introduced me to your colleague at his office party as your husband. And when he turned to greet someone else, you said to his wife, before she'd asked you a single thing. I know. As if her silent face was asking a question you were already ashamed to answer. Another pause. In the 9th year, you sat across from me at the kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening and told me that the only reason you hadn't left was that you couldn't afford to. He let that land cleanly. You said that to my face, Vivienne.
And then you poured yourself a second glass of wine. The room was absolutely still. I didn't tell you what I was worth, Daniel continued, because what I was worth to you had already been made completely clear. You had told me, in every way you had available to you in 100 small moments across 12 years, the money was separate from what you valued in a person, and you had demonstrated very thoroughly what you valued. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance a fraction. You spent 12 years trying to make me feel like nothing. What you didn't know was that I was watching, I was remembering, and I was deciding. Vivienne's eyes were bright. She did not move. You filed this divorce to take everything from a man you were certain had nothing, Daniel said. That was your choice, made freely, with full confidence. The consequences of that choice are what they are. He sat back. I don't wish you harm.
I mean that. But I will not pretend this outcome is unfair. It isn't. It is exactly fair. Gregory Fitch was studying his legal pad with the fixed concentration of a man who wanted very much to be somewhere else. Vivienne said nothing for a long time. The composure she had maintained across the table held for a while longer, and then it gave way, not in a collapse, not in a scene, but in the slow, quiet way that things give way when they have been holding too long. Her hands, clasped on the table, whitened at the knuckles. Her jaw set hard, and then, in a voice she could not quite keep steady, she said, I didn't know. No, Daniel said quietly. You didn't, because you never tried to. That was the end of it. Not the end of the legal proceedings which ground forward for several more weeks with the machinery of due process, but that was the end of anything that needed to pass between them. The session concluded. The parties rose. Daniel collected his jacket from the back of his chair, exchanged a nod with James, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. Vivienne stayed at the table for a while after everyone else had gone. Gregory gathered his papers. The room cleared. She sat alone in the neutral, coffee-smelling room, in the chair across from an empty chair, and she looked at the space where Daniel had been sitting. The divorce was finalized on a grey January morning. By that point, the drama had already concluded. The court's final division was precise and cold. Vivienne received the joint marital assets to which she was legally entitled, her share of the savings accounts, her portion of the joint investment portfolio, the retirement funds that were genuinely hers. It was not nothing, but set against what she had been reaching for and what she had lost through her own conduct, it was not what she had wanted. It was not remotely close. The spousal support claim had been dismissed. The house remained in Daniel's name. Gregory Fitch submitted his final invoice. It was substantial. Vivienne moved into an apartment in the city, not Eleanor's guest suite, which had become suffocating in ways both mother and daughter had quietly stopped pretending it hadn't. The apartment was perfectly reasonable. It was clean and well located and had good light in the mornings. It was not the life Vivienne had imagined when she had filed those papers with the certainty of someone sure they were taking the upper hand. It was not even close. Eleanor Voss spent the early months of that year doing what people of her social standing always do when something shattering has occurred. She controlled the narrative. She told people the divorce had been mutual. She told people Vivian was thriving. She said it fewer and fewer times as the months went on, because the story had a way of arriving in every room before Eleanor did. And the expressions on people's faces, politely neutral, carefully unrevealing, told her everything she needed to know about how much they already knew. Daniel Hargrove, meanwhile, did something that surprised no one who actually knew him and astonished everyone who had assumed they did. He did nothing dramatic. He did not buy a tower or appear in a publication or host a party to mark his freedom. He went back to work. He did, however, make one significant and deliberate change. In the spring following the divorce, after conversations with James Whitfield that had been developing quietly in the background for years, Daniel established the Hargrove Foundation, a private charitable organization dedicated to educational access and vocational training for young people from low-income backgrounds. He seeded it with $300 million from his personal portfolio and chaired the board himself. He named it after his father. There was no press release, there was no launch event. The foundation simply began doing what it had been designed to do, funding programs and building partnerships with the same quiet, systematic efficiency that had characterized everything Daniel had ever built. The first cohort of scholarship recipients, 42 young people from 7 states, started their programs the following September. Daniel drove to the orientation event in the same 10-year-old sedan. He stood at the back of the room and watched them file in, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for a very long time. Sometime in the autumn of that year, Daniel met a woman named Claire at a fundraising event hosted by one of the foundation's partner organizations. She was a civil engineer who had grown up in modest circumstances, who asked questions that required actual thinking to answer, and who had a particular way of listening that made the person she was listening to feel, without effort or performance, genuinely heard. She did not know who Daniel Hargrove was beyond the fact that he was on the board of a charitable foundation. She knew he drove an old car. She knew he was quiet and unhurried. She knew he apparently felt very strongly about a particular turntable. On their third meeting, she asked him what he did for work. He told her honestly. Not everything, not all at once, but honestly, without deflection, with the directness of a man who had spent a long time keeping a secret and had discovered that the keeping had cost him something real. She listened to all of it, without her expression changing much. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That sounds like it takes a great deal of patience." Daniel looked at her. "It does," he said. "Good," Claire said. "I find I like patient people." And she smiled in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with what he was worth and everything to do with who he was. There was a moment, several weeks after the divorce was finalized, when Vivienne ran into a mutual acquaintance at a dry cleaner on the east side of the city. The woman, a person Vivienne had sat beside at dinner parties for years, smiled warmly and asked how she was doing. Vivienne said she was fine. The woman said she had heard about Daniel's foundation, how remarkable it was, what good work it was doing already. She said she had always sensed he was someone extraordinary, hadn't Vivienne? Vivienne agreed that yes, she had always sensed that. Then she collected her clothes from the counter and walked out to the street and stood in the cold for a moment before she could make herself move again. The last time Vivienne Hargrove encountered Daniel's name formally, it was in a brief financial news item, not about him directly, but about Meridian Capital Partners, which had completed a significant strategic acquisition that pushed the company's consolidated value past $50 billion. The item was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned the beneficial owner by name in the final line. Vivienne saw it while scrolling through a news application early on a weekday morning, coffee in hand, standing in the kitchen of her city apartment. She read his name. She read the number beside it. Then she set her phone face down on the counter. She stood in the kitchen for a while, in the morning quiet, the coffee getting cold in her hand. Then she poured it down the drain and went to get ready for the day. There is a particular and very specific cruelty in believing you know the value of something and being completely wrong. It is the cruelty of the assessor who walks through a dusty room, glances at a painting in a tarnished frame, and calls it worthless, only to watch years later as that same painting sells at auction for more than the assessor will earn in a lifetime. The painting did not change, the assessor's perception did, and the painting was never diminished by the wrong valuation. Only the assessor was in the end. Daniel Hargrove had known his value for a very long time. He had not needed anyone to confirm it. He had not built his fortune to prove a point or to wound anyone who had doubted him, because the fortune had never been connected to those things in his mind. He had built it the way a craftsman builds. For the love of the craft, for the satisfaction of the work done well, he had only ever needed the patience to wait and the wisdom to build something worth the waiting. The cruelest part of this story for Vivian was never the money. It was never really the money. The cruelest part was the realization that arrived slowly, over many months in a decent apartment she had not planned on, that she had been wrong about everything. Not just about the numbers in a bank account, about the man, about what mattered, about what she had actually had within reach for 12 years, and what she had chosen to do with it, day after ordinary day, until there was nothing left to choose. That realization, unlike a settlement figure, did not resolve itself. It simply remained. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have revealed the truth sooner, or would you have waited exactly as he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. There is no wrong answer here, and we genuinely want to hear from you. True worth is rarely announced. It is simply quietly present, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And the people who mistake silence for weakness, patience for emptiness, and stillness for defeat will find in the end that they were the ones who were never paying attention. If this story moved you, if it felt like something you needed to hear today, please give it a like. It costs nothing and it helps more people find stories like this one. And I will see you in the next video.